When a judge abused his power, then she refused to stay silent. Nia Brooks uncovered a dangerous truth that Judge Alden was rigging the system, destroying lives with a stroke of his pen. With every step toward justice, the walls closed in, threats lurking in every shadow. Fired, blacklisted, and betrayed, she had no allies left, until an unseen force struck back. As the battle for truth ignites, one question remains: will she survive the price of justice? Nia Brooks walked through the towering glass doors of the federal courthouse, her heels tapping against the polished marble floor. The air carried the faint scent of old books and freshly brewed coffee, mixing with the quiet murmur of clerks and attorneys moving through the halls. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting sharp lines across the lobby. She had dreamt of this moment for years, standing here, ready to begin her career in law. At 26, Nia had worked tirelessly to reach this point. Late nights, studying, internships, networking, it had all led her here, to a prestigious clerkship under Judge Henry Alden. He was a man whose name carried weight in legal circles, known for his firm, yet fair approach to justice. This position wasn't just a job. It was the key to her future, a stepping stone to everything she had ever wanted. Taking a steadying breath, she adjusted the strap of her bag and approached the security checkpoint. A guard scanned her ID and waved her through. The elevators gleamed like mirrors as she stepped inside, pressing the button for the 12th floor. The ride up was smooth, but a nervous energy hummed beneath her excitement. When the door slid open, she stepped into a quiet hallway lined with bookshelves filled with thick legal volumes. The judge's chambers were at the end, the door already open. Inside, the scent of leather and paper filled the room, and a heavy wooden desk sat at the center, stacked with case files. Judge Alden stood by the window, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit perfectly tailored. "Nia Brooks," he said, turning toward her with a small nod. His voice was measured, his expression unreadable. "Welcome." "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, hoping he didn't notice the slight shake in her voice. She had spent years preparing for this, but standing before him now, the weight of it settled on her shoulders. He gestured toward the other clerks. "You'll be working closely with David and Ellen. They'll show you the ropes." David, a tall man with a sharp gaze, nodded in greeting. Ellen, who looked to be in her early 30s, offered a brief smile before returning to the document in front of her. The room was filled with the quiet rustle of papers and the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard. Over the next few days, Nia found herself quickly adapting. She analyzed legal arguments, drafted memos, and reviewed sentencing recommendations. The work was challenging, but she thrived in the fast-paced environment. Judge Alden expected precision, and she made sure to deliver. When he called on her for input, she gave well-reasoned answers. David and Ellen seemed to approve, though their praise was rare and brief. One afternoon, while sorting through case files, she noticed a pattern that made her pause. A young black man, first-time offender, sentenced to 15 years for drug possession. Another, a minor fraud case, 10 years. She flipped through more files, scanning the sentences. The numbers stood out in stark contrast to similar cases involving white defendants, who often received probation or significantly lighter sentences. A frown pulled at her lips. It could be a coincidence. Judges followed sentencing guidelines, and every case had nuances. Still, the pattern gnawed at her. Something wrong. Ellen's voice broke through her thoughts. Nia glanced up, hesitating for a second before shaking her head. "No, just making sure I'm reading this right." Ellen didn't press, already turning back to her screen. Nia forced herself to do the same, filing the thought away for later. She wasn't here to question things. She was here to learn. That night, as she packed up her things, she glanced at the stack of cases once more. She had worked so hard to get here, to be taken seriously in this field. If there was something wrong, it wasn't her place to judge. Not yet. Still, the numbers lingered in her mind as she stepped into the elevator, the soft ding announcing her descent. The following morning, Nia settled into her chair, flipping open the case file for Jamal Reed. A first-time offender caught with a small amount of marijuana, 15 years. Her brow knitted as she scanned the details, then pulled up another case on her screen. Similar circumstances, different outcome. The defendant, a white college student, had received probation and community service. Her stomach clenched. She leaned closer to her monitor, double-checking the sentencing recommendations from the probation office. They had originally suggested a 3-year sentence for Jamal. But beside the recommendation, Judge Alden's notes were scribbled in the margins. Justifications for the increased sentence, citing the need for stricter deterrence. Her pulse quickened. She clicked through more files, comparing cases side by side. Each time, she found the same pattern. Harsh sentences for black defendants. Lighter ones for white defendants with nearly identical charges. David walked by her desk, glancing at her screen. Heavy case. Nia forced a neutral expression. Just making sure I get the details right. He nodded and moved on, but the back of her neck tingled as she returned her focus to the documents. Something wasn't right. The sentencing disparities were too consistent to be random. Determined to dig deeper, she opened archived files, looking at previous cases Judge Alden had ruled on over the years. Each time, the original recommendations had been reasonable, and each time, he had overruled them, raising the sentences. Her breath grew shallow as a realization settled in her chest. He was altering the outcomes. Deliberately, she closed the files, pressing her fingers against her temples. Her head throbbed with questions she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. The man she had admired, the judge she had dreamed of working for, was not the man she thought he was. At lunch, she sat across from Ellen, barely touching her salad. The usual chatter of clerks filled the break room, but her mind was elsewhere. Ellen sipped her coffee and glanced up. "You seem lost in thought." Nia hesitated, weighing her words. "Have you ever noticed any patterns in sentencing?" Ellen's face remained neutral. Every judge has their philosophy on sentencing. Alden believes in deterrence. Nia's stomach churned. Even when it's not fair. Ellen lowered her coffee cup. Fairness isn't always the priority. The law is complicated. Nia wanted to press further, but Ellen's expression warned her to let it go. The unease that had started as a whisper in the back of her mind now grew louder. That evening, long after most clerks had left, Nia sat alone in the office, staring at the glowing screen. The files were still open, the proof staring back at her. She couldn't unsee it. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. If she reported this, it could ruin her career before it even started. If she stayed quiet, she would be complicit. Her chest tightened. She wasn't ready for this decision, but the truth had already found her, and there was no turning back. Nia sat in the dim glow of her desk lamp, the weight of the case files pressing against her conscience. The numbers had been right there in black and white, undeniable. But what could she do? Who would listen to a law clerk accusing a respected judge of bias? A single name came to mind: Professor Evelyn Peter. The woman had been more than a professor. She had been a mentor, a guiding force through law school. If anyone could help her see a path forward, it was her. That afternoon, Nia slipped out of the courthouse and made her way across town to the university campus. The familiar ivy-covered building loomed before her, bringing back memories of late-night study sessions and debates in lecture halls. She found Professor Peter in her office, a small space cluttered with legal textbooks and stacks of graded papers. "Nia," the professor said warmly, setting down her pen. "I was wondering when you'd stop by." Nia eased into the chair opposite her desk, fingers clasped tightly in her lap. "I need your advice," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I think I found something. Something wrong." Professor Peter's expression grew serious. "Tell me." Nia explained everything. The sentencing patterns, the judge's handwritten notes increasing the sentences, the undeniable discrepancies. As she spoke, the professor's brow creased, her sharp eyes studying Nia carefully. When Nia finished, Professor Peter sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You're treading dangerous ground." Nia's stomach nodded. "But it's real. Shouldn't someone do something?" "Should and will are two different things," the professor said carefully. "Judge Alden is powerful. If you bring this up publicly, he won't go down quietly." Nia swallowed. "So, you're saying I should ignore it?" "I'm saying be careful," Professor Peter said. "There are ways to expose the truth, but you need to understand the risks. Judges hold influence. One wrong move, and you could find doors closing before you even step through them." Nia nodded slowly, her heart pounding. She had come for a clear answer, but all she had now were more questions. The next day, Nia sat across from Judge Alden in his chambers, a stack of case files between them. She forced her hands to remain steady as she turned a page, her voice even. I've noticed some inconsistencies in sentencing. The judge didn't look up. Every case is unique. Yes, but the patterns can be misleading. He interrupted, his tone firm. You're young, Nia. Still learning. The law is more than numbers on a page. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But in these cases, the sentencing recommendations were much lower. Yet the final decisions. Judge Alden finally met her gaze. His stare was unreadable. Some criminals require stronger deterrence. We have to consider the greater good. A chill settled over Nia. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Later that evening, as Nia packed up her desk, Judge Alden's voice echoed in her mind. The way he had spoken, not just dismissing her concerns, but warning her. She had almost made it to the elevator when she heard his voice again. Nia. She turned. He stood in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back. You have a promising future ahead, he said. People are watching. It's important to know when to speak and when to listen. Her pulse thudded. It wasn't a reminder. It was a message. She forced a polite smile. Understood, Your Honor. The judge nodded, then turned away. As Nia stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut, she realized something. She had a choice to make. And the cost of that choice had never been clearer. Next morning, courthouse hallways felt narrower, the air heavier. Nia sat at her desk, back straight, fingers gliding across the keyboard as she pulled up more case files. The glow from her monitor reflected off her glasses as she compared sentencing records, her eyes moving quickly between columns of names, charges, and punishments. The deeper she dug, the more the pattern became undeniable. It was all there: black defendants receiving harsher sentences, white defendants walking away with probation. She saved every document she could, transferring them to a secured flash drive tucked beneath a stack of law journals in her drawer. But as she continued, something changed. Certain files she had accessed just days ago were suddenly restricted. A notification flashed across her screen: access denied. Nia's heart thumped as she clicked again, only to receive the same message. One by one, the documents were disappearing behind security barriers. Someone knew what she was doing. A shadow moved in her periphery. Claire Dawson stood near the filing cabinets, eyes lingering on Nia's screen before she turned away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Claire had always been cold, but now there was something else, something calculating. That night, Nia lay awake in her small apartment, the city's hum seeping through the windows. She turned over, staring at the ceiling. She had stepped too close, and now she was being watched. The courtroom was colder than usual, the weight of the wood-paneled walls pressing down on everyone inside. Nia sat behind the defense table, hands gripping her notepad. She had taken a morning off to support her brother, Marcus Brooks, as he stood before Judge Alden. The case was simple: a minor drug possession charge. A first offense. Nothing violent, nothing serious. The sentencing recommendation had been probation, maybe a fine. But Nia already knew what was coming. Judge Alden peered down from the bench, flipping through the file as though he hadn't already decided. Marcus Brooks, he said, his voice smooth, deliberate. This court has taken into account the severity of your actions. Nia's stomach turned. I find that a strong deterrent is necessary. Her breath caught as he continued. 5 years in state prison. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney stood. Your Honor, the recommendation was probation. My ruling is final. Alden's gaze flickered to Nia for the briefest second before he struck the gavel down. Marcus didn't react at first. He turned slightly, searching for Nia in the crowd. She clenched her fists beneath the table, every muscle in her body tensed. The bailiff moved toward him, cuffs ready. Nia forced herself to stand, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't justice. Alden lifted his chin. Miss Brooks, control yourself. She opened her mouth, but Marcus gave the smallest shake of his head. She couldn't fix this here. Not now. Her hands trembled as she sat back down, watching as her brother was led away. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, but she knew one thing. She wasn't just fighting for a stranger anymore. Nia stormed into the clerk's office, pushing past desks and stacks of files. She barely heard David call after her. Reaching her own desk, she yanked open the drawer and pulled out the flash drive, her mind racing. If she spoke up, she would be risking everything. Her job, her future, her credibility. The system protected its own, and Judge Alden had power, more than she had ever realized. But staying silent, that meant Marcus would sit behind bars. That meant Jamal Reed and countless others would continue to have their lives stolen by a system designed to crush them. She ran a hand over her face, forcing in a steady breath. There was no way out of this without consequences. One path led to silence and complicity. The other, she turned the flash drive over in her fingers. The other meant war. She stared at her computer screen, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She could almost hear Marcus's voice in her head, telling her to be smart, to think before she acted. But thinking wasn't enough anymore. She plugged in the drive. The truth had to come out. David Langston's name glowed on Nia's phone screen. She had hesitated before pressing send, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her chest. But now, there was no turning back. The moment she hit that call button, everything would change. The phone rang twice before a measured voice answered. "Langston, this is Nia Brooks," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "I have information you need to see." There was a pause. "Go on." She inhaled. "It's about Judge Alden. I have sentencing records. Patterns. Handwritten notes. He's been deliberately increasing sentences for black defendants while reducing them for white ones." Langston didn't respond right away. When he did, his tone was unreadable. "Meet me in person." They agreed on a coffee shop miles from the courthouse, a place neither of them frequented. Nia arrived early, settling into a back corner where she could see the door. The flash drive sat in her pocket, its weight heavier than it should have been. Langston arrived exactly on time. He slid into the chair across from her, setting a black notebook on the table. "Tell me everything." Nia didn't waste words. She outlined the patterns she had uncovered, the files that had disappeared, the sentencing hearing for Marcus. Langston listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away. When she finished, she placed a flash drive on the table between them. "It's all here." Langston picked it up, turning in his fingers. "You understand what this means for you?" "Yes." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'll be in touch." The courthouse felt different the next day. Judge Alden's eyes lingered on her longer than usual, his expression unreadable. Nia kept her face neutral, moving through her work with the same efficiency as always. But something had shifted. She could feel it. At lunchtime, he called her into his chambers. She closed the door behind her, careful to keep her expression calm. The room was lined with towering bookshelves, the scent of polished wood and old paper thick in the air. Alden stood near his desk, hands folded behind his back. "You've been asking a lot of questions," he said after a long silence. Nia met his gaze. "It's my job to review cases thoroughly." His lips pressed together. "You have a bright future ahead of you, Nia, but only if you learn to be pragmatic. The law isn't black and white." She didn't answer. Alden walked around his desk, his movements slow, deliberate. Loyalty is important in this profession. One wrong step, and doors close. Permanently. The threat hung between them, unspoken but clear. Nia held his gaze. "I understand, Your Honor." Alden nodded once, then gestured toward the door. "That will be all." She turned and left, keeping her posture steady. But inside, her pulse drummed. He knew. 2 days later, the investigation was announced. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Nia stood outside the main office, phone buzzing with messages as clerks and attorneys whispered in hushed voices. A formal inquiry into Judge Alden's sentencing practices had begun. By midday, he had released a statement denying all allegations. He called the accusations baseless, an attack on his reputation by a disgruntled individual. Nia's name wasn't in the statement, but it didn't have to be. Everyone knew. She returned to her desk to find an email from the chief clerk. Her position had been terminated, effective immediately. She stared at the screen. She had known this would happen. She had prepared for it, but knowing didn't make it easier. Packing up her desk was surreal. Some colleagues avoided her entirely. Others offered quiet, careful nods of respect. A few whispered their support when no one was listening. When she stepped into the elevator for the last time, she didn't look back. Weeks passed. No firm would hire her. Interviews started strong, but ended with polite rejections. Firms didn't want the risk of hiring a whistleblower. Even the ones that agreed with her decision wouldn't take the chance. Money ran tight. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her. But through it all, she didn't regret a single moment. One evening, an email arrived from a small legal advocacy group. They had seen what she had done. They admired her courage, and they wanted her to join them. The salary was modest. The office was nothing like the polished halls of the courthouse. But the work mattered, and that was enough. Months later, Nia walked past the courthouse steps, a place that had once defined her future. Now, it was simply part of her past. She had lost security, lost the path she had once carefully planned. But in its place, she had found something stronger. She had found purpose, and that was worth everything.